The pro-Palestinian protests and sit-ins that have spread across US universities in recent weeks must remain peaceful. That was the warning from the White House on Sunday. John Kirby's comments coming after some 275 people were arrested across 4 separate campuses over the weekend, sometimes in dramatic scenes with police wearing riot gear and using tasers. On Sunday, pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian demonstrators clashed briefly at California's UCLA, while protests continue at Columbia University in New York, where the university protest movement began in earnest. Let's take a listen.
We are doing this until we get our demands. We are doing this until the university, UCLA, divests, disclose, ends their silence, academic divestment, and does not continue to, or doesn't use police force for our peaceful protests. Those are our 5 demands. We will accomplish divestment. We are going to stay here until that. Without divestment, the siege will not end. We need to put pressure now. Historically, this is how it has happened on many universities, and we are going to continue to push for that, and we will not leave.
The encampment itself is incredibly peaceful. I'm a Jewish student. I feel very, very safe here. And any antagonism, any contention really comes from the outside and comes from people not understanding and making a lot of assumptions about what it means to believe in Palestinian liberation, when ultimately this fight is about a fight for justice and for peace.
Well, for more on those ongoing pro-Palestinian protests across US universities, we can bring in Richard Johnson, lecturer in US politics at Queen Mary University of London. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24 today. Now, as I mentioned just then, the White House has now weighed in, calling for campus protests to remain peaceful. Is that warning going to have any impact, do you think?
I think that the White House has relatively little control over what goes on the campuses. But of course, they don't want to see violence on the campuses. People of an older generation will remember the protests that took place on US university campuses during the Vietnam War. And in some cases, those protests did become violent. The infamous example of the Kent State University protests in Ohio led to the deaths of students who were protesting. And we know now that President Richard Nixon wanted to take a tough line against those students. And this was all sort of part of his appeal to Middle America. This is not the same approach that Joe Biden wants to see, and I think Biden would just hope that the protests carry on, if they must carry on peacefully, and are resolved quietly.
Now, the protesters that we're seeing are demanding that their universities cut, among other things, all financial ties to Israel because of the ongoing war in Gaza. Is there any sign in the US that universities are considering heeding those calls from their students?
We might see some pressure put on the universities in that respect. I think the most recent comparison that we might make is if we look at the 2020 protests for racial justice after the killing of George Floyd. There were moves both at US universities and also actually in corporate America to take certain steps to show that there was that universities and other institutions were putting their money where their mouth was when it came to racial justice, whether that was creating up new diversity, equity, and inclusion roles or departments or initiatives. And so we might see some move from certain universities in that respect, but I wouldn't necessarily expect a national boycott of Israel by American universities by any measure. Those ties are probably too close at certain institutions to see them broken.
Now, a number of Jewish groups say that these protests have been a hotbed for anti-Semitism, that they make Jewish students feel unsafe on campus. What are American universities trying to do or doing right now to try to make Jewish students feel safe?
I mean, some of the rhetoric that has been heard at these protests has been very concerning, and there is, in some cases, there is slippage between people's criticism of the actions of the Israeli government vis-a-vis Gaza and more fundamental arguments that are being made against the very existence of Israel itself. And given that 90% of Jewish people view Israel as something that's important to their identity, that is often read as hostility to Jewish people, even if the people who are making those anti-Israel comments might not always think that what they're saying is anti-Jewish. And I think this is a very difficult thread for US universities to push through the needle in a sense, because they have these very vocal activists on their campus who are very critical of Israel, but at the same time they have an important duty to protect Jewish students, and for students who are both Jewish and pro-Israel. I think this is key. There are of course some Jewish students, and in fact in your feature you interviewed someone who was Jewish who was very critical of what was going on. But there are many Jewish students who are also pro-Israel, and I think those are the students who feel most vulnerable at this particular time.
Now, we are, of course, in the US heading into a presidential election. Young students tend to vote Democrat, but how much, in your opinion, is the war in Gaza losing support for Biden in this demographic, a demographic that historically he's been able to rely on?
So there was an interesting CNN poll that came out over the weekend. It showed Trump at 49% and Biden at 43%, a 6-point Trump lead. The Israel-Gaza situation was Biden's worst issue. He had 71% disapproval overall on that issue and 81% disapproval from young voters on this issue. In this same poll, Trump was leading among young voters, 51 to 40%. This is concerning for Biden, to put it lightly, given that traditionally, at least in recent electoral cycles, young voters have been staunchly Democratic-leaning electorates. But what I would say is that I think that we would make a mistake in thinking that Biden's low support among young voters, relatively speaking, is only due to the situation in Israel and Gaza. When young voters are asked in polls to rank how important this issue is, it tends to rank quite lowly. In fact, in a recent poll, out of 16 issues, the situation in Israel and Gaza was ranked number 15 out of 16 by young voters. So if you actually look at why young voters are peeling away from Biden, it often has much more to do with inflation, the economy, difficulty of finding affordable housing. And so those are some of the more bread and butter issues that Biden should be stronger on, and he needs to be able to convey an effective message to young voters that he's taking their concerns when it comes to economic matters seriously as well.
Richard Johnson, lecturer in US politics at Queen Mary University of London. Thank you very much for speaking to us on France 24 today.
Thank you.